So what is REDCap? Um, the name stands for Research Electronic Data Capture, and it is at its core a data capture and data storage tool. It's not necessarily what you'll use to run your stats or make graphs. It's really just to collect and store data. And it is a web-based tool for building and managing databases and surveys. It's developed by Vanderbilt University, and how it works is Vanderbilt basically gives the code to institutions that want to use REDCap, as long as those institutions support REDCap. So it's developed by Vanderbilt, they give it to us, but we support it. So each institution that has REDCap has its own separate, what we call an instance. Um, REDCap, why it's used so much around here is because it's user friendly. You don't necessarily have to be a database administrator or any type of coder or web developer to be able to build these web-based databases. It has built-in quality assurance, quality improvement features, and very importantly, it is HIPAA compliant. Um, and we have backup. So I'm going to talk about production mode in a few slides. And when you are in production mode, we have continuous backups for a major data loss event. So if anything were to happen where our REDCap instance completely got wiped out, we can restore it back to a specific point in time. That is for the entire instance of REDCap. We also take nightly copies so that if there's individual projects that maybe delete a few records um, that they didn't intend to, we can go back into those nightly copies and get those few records. So the continuous backups are for something like a natural disaster or if something malicious happened, and nightly copies are more for the like, oops, I accidentally deleted something from my project and I need it back. Um, each of these are kept for 30 days. So we have a continuous 30-day rolling copies and backups of our database. So there's always 30 backups or 30 copies of your project that exist. But if you delete something, make sure to that you need restored, make sure to contact us quickly because you're on kind of a 30-day timer with those backups. And if you're using REDCap, you're in good company. REDCap has nearly 8,000 instances across the globe and nearly 500,000 users. Now, one thing I mentioned is each one of these instances is hosted by its own institution. So if you have friends at other universities, there may be some features of their REDCap that we don't have, and vice versa. There may be some things that we have that they do not have. Okay, WashU REDCap. So as I mentioned a few times, we're one instance of REDCap. We have about 4,000 active users every year and 5,000 active projects, and we provide various types of support to our users. We have self-service support, which I'll go over on the next slide. Basic free support, which is when you reach out to us with questions. You can put a biostatistician on your project that is a REDCap expert and can take care of data management all the way up to basically everything on your project. If you have that funding to add them part of their salary onto your project. And then we have some fee for service if you need somebody just to build a project, or if you need a data pull from Epic into REDCap, we have some of that. And then we have a user community. So the self-service support is really our documentation. Our most robust area is our FAQs. I'll show you how to access that once we're in REDCap. And the best place to go first if you have a question is our FAQs, because that is the fastest. If you can find it in those, that is the easiest thing to do. We have a few user guides and then training resources page that goes into more advanced and specific topics. We have a policy page that goes over user account information. So if you get, your password goes bad or you need guest accounts, that information's there. If you publish or you are submitting a grant, we've got language for acknowledging REDCap. The more we do that, the more we ensure that REDCap funding goes long, long into the future. Um, and we also have advanced project design features, documentation there. If you search through there and you don't find what you need, you can submit a ticket. And again, I'll get these slides out to you so you'll have these links, but they're also available kind of all over the place within REDCap. And when you submit tickets, we can help you search for functionality, troubleshoot issues with projects, try to develop workarounds if there's no specific functionality in REDCap or tools in REDCap that provide the functionality you want. We can help you with some advanced logic or creating reports. We put kind of a soft limit of 3 hours on this. We're not going to cut you off if we've been working with you for a few hours and it's approaching 3 hours, but essentially we may, if you email us and you give us a big question like I'm creating a multi-site randomized clinical trial and I need to know everything. We might send you to biostats for something like that because that goes a little bit beyond our basic free support. So speaking of which, as I mentioned, if you have funding, you can put a biostatistician on your project. They can help with data management, or you can even go up to what I would call full service support, where they're building and managing your REDCap database for you. That would be putting salary support for that person onto your grant. But we do have fee for service, which is hourly fees, $150 an hour. I guess I don't have that on here, but those are for project builds if you just want somebody to build your project and then you manage it. And we also have Epic data pulls if you need to pull some structured fields from Epic into REDCap. We can turn that on for a fee. And there is a process to go through where you have a consultation and then a statement of work is drawn up if you want to continue forward with the work, and then you sign it, and then you're never charged until that happens. And finally, we have a user community where once a month I host a meeting just to go over some updates of what's going on in REDCap. I also do some demonstration of more advanced topics or specific topics or topics that people are just having trouble with. And I also go over some questions that we've received from users over the past week just to help you, try to learn more, try to learn from other people's questions, things like that. And if you join the Teams channel, you can ask questions of your fellow REDCap users, and then I also jump in there and reply as well. Okay, so now that you know all the places where you can get help for REDCap and a little bit about kind of the big picture of what REDCap is, let's talk about some of the reasons people use REDCap, and then we'll switch into basic terminology. Okay. So REDCap has a lot of quality assurance and quality improvement features, which is what, when you see the QA, QI, that's what that means. So some of these are simple things like having easy discrimination between data entry points. If you've ever entered data into a giant spreadsheet, CSV, Excel, Access, or anything else, you know that that can be very easy to make errors when you're entering into a giant spreadsheet. So having easy discrimination is a quality improvement feature. We have data validation, where we can say only a specific type of data can be entered into this field. So here we're saying only a date, and we're saying only with a specific format. You can also there's a lot of other ways you can validate your fields. You can make them so they only contain numbers with a specific range, zip codes, phone numbers. We'll go over that as we get into the demonstrations. You can also make some fields mandatory. So if you have some that are mandatory and others that are not, you can do that. And some things happening in the background, you can mark cells as identifiers to help protect your data. You can automatically log, REDCap automatically logs who entered data or modified each piece of data, as well as any changes that happen to the field and into fields. So basically, if you enter data here. Anytime data is entered, REDCap stores who entered that data and what time. And also if you make changes here, it stores that, which, you know, I'm not sure how that sounds to you, but it actually is really beneficial. It helps to go back and correct mistakes because there's always mistakes in a long research project or a project in REDCap that goes on for a long time. And so it's really useful for that. And several other things. I use it all the time when I'm troubleshooting projects. And there's built-in security. You have to log in with your Woostle key and you can set project level user rights. Okay, so what I'm going to go through is just kind of a simplified workflow of this. Now, I talk specifically about research. My background's in research. REDCap was originally built for collecting research data. Do know that we have a wide range of data that gets collected in REDCap. We have everything from clinical trials to people collecting RSVPs for happy hours. So we have a wide range. Many people use it for a application system if they have a training program or grant funding that people are applying for. So even though I'm generally talking about research, just note that this can be several different types of data that you're collecting in REDCap. Okay, so traditionally in research, we're collecting data on paper using pen and paper. If you're a clinical researcher, you might, have a demographics form or some other type of survey or form that you're getting information from a patient or a participant. If you're a basic scientist, you might have the lab notebook. And then as REDCap started to come in, people started to store their data, transfer their data into REDCap. The most kind of the structured parts of data, parts that were going to need to be stored and analyzed. Also, REDCap allows you to completely eliminate paper if you would like. You can either enter data directly into REDCap forms, or you can deliver surveys directly to participants or patients or applicants, whoever you're working with, and get rid of the paper and have the data entered directly into REDCap. Now, as I mentioned, REDCap's not necessarily for making figures or analyzing data, doing statistical analyses. So what do you do once you've collected enough data to begin doing some of those processes? Well, you can then export it to either CSV Excel files or common statistical packages to work on your next step of your data, kind of the data life cycle. If you're moving on to have data visualization or data analyses, you can export that into the type of format that you would like. Um, Now, a couple other things that people really like with REDCap is if you're collecting data over a long period of time, say you're doing follow-up data collections every 2 months over a 3-year period, you can create events and you can collect data on this same form over multiple events. Okay, so you don't have to make this form over and over and over. And then if you make a modification, you have to modify each of those. You can make one form and then you create events and you can make your project longitudinal in that way. You also have what's called repeating instruments, which will go over the events and longitudinal projects. We won't get to repeating instruments in this introductory session, but in the repeating instance, these are often for things like adverse events or how many hospitalizations somebody has after a surgery or something like that, where the number of times it's going to happen isn't known. But you can make these projects more complex, even though the basics of REDCap is pretty simple. You can make them more complex depending on the type of project that you're collecting data for. Okay, so now let's get into the terminology. And first of all, let's talk about projects. So when you log into REDCap the first time, you will most likely not have any projects on your My Projects page. Um, you need to either create a project or have somebody add you to a project before you see any projects here. As you can see, I have a big list of projects, and how I think of this is almost like if I open a file explorer on my desktop, and I've got a bunch of different folders that relate to different projects. Each one of these separates into separate in this section. Well, for me, this is a bunch of different courses that I teach, and then some example projects up here. For you, you might have a bunch of different trials or grants that you're on eventually once you start getting added to projects or creating projects. But the projects are the web-based databases. They're made up of collection tools called instruments, which your project could have several instruments. I mean, I've seen, several dozens of instruments, like 50, 60 instruments. The way I think of these instruments is if you're in the paper world and you're collecting data, it would be each form that you would put kind of in a hanging folder for the patient when they come in or the participant when they come in. So you're basically building a digital version of each of those forms within the project. And I'll mention forms and surveys or both, and I'll distinguish those more thoroughly in a few slides. Um, while you may have some that are several instruments, some projects that are several instruments, you may also have some that are just a single form or a single survey. So if you're sending one survey out to a lot of people, that might be all that's in your project. And there's actually times when multiple projects for a single study or a single, if you're working on some other type of project may make sense. I gave some examples here. So if you're doing a registry, you might have one project for patient info, one project for specimen info. So there's no PHI linking here to the specimen. You might have a clinical trial where you're blinding some people, and you could put the blinded data in one project and the unblinded data in another project. And then in some cases, if you've got a legacy project, a project that's been going on for like a decade or collected a lot of records, a lot of data, it may be becoming just slow and difficult to use. So there's some times where you might just copy a project and then that project becomes a repository, and then you move forward with a new project. I have an asterisk here because that would be something that there's a lot of considerations to breaking an active project apart into separate projects. So um, if you're new and you're a beginner, you're probably not doing something like this. This would probably be a discussion with the principal investigator, some other people on the project, and just making sure you're doing everything you need to do before you separate these projects. Essentially, you would have to decide if you're going to continue to make updates to the original project as you move forward and some other things. Okay, let's talk about development and production status. When you create a project, like we're going to do shortly, you create a project in development status. That's default, and you can test and modify your project here. So when you create a project in REDCap and you're in development mode and you're not collecting real patient data, real participant data, you can do as much testing and kind of modifying and anything you want to do to your project. And I encourage you to. You can do anything in here. You're not going to break REDCap by testing things in REDCap. So I encourage you to try some of the different features on projects that are in development mode. And you can create a project in development mode if you've got a project that's ongoing and you want to try something and you don't want to try it on your project that's in production mode. You can create a development project and try different things there. But once you've done a lot of testing and you've got your project ready to collect the real data that you're planning to collect, you should move to production status. It really is just a click of a button and then telling me whether you want all the projects, or excuse me, all the data that's been collected to stay, or if you want to delete all the all the data that's been collected before you move forward. Like if you have a bunch of test data in your project, you can just select delete all this, let's start fresh. Um, but I encourage you to move to production status. Historically, some people have chosen to stay in development because they're making changes to their project. Um, I understand that, but I also would say that you can still make most modifications to your project automatically while you're in production mode. If you add fields or add instruments, those go through automatically. The only thing that we approve, that we see and approve, are anything that could cause problems to data that's been collected. So if you're deleting fields that have data, that comes to us just to confirm, like, hey, are you sure you want to do this? Because a lot of times those things can happen in error. Maybe you can hide the field instead of completely deleting it or something like that. Talked a lot about instruments. Um, So the project is kind of the overall where you're collecting all your data, and then you can break that data down into instruments. These are web pages made up of a series of fields or data collection points. They're pretty easy to modify and customize to your project. Again, a lot of how REDCap is it's built to be user friendly, but there's a lot of additional features that you can build on to add functionality to your project. But the basics are pretty simple point and click. Um, so you can have different types of instruments such as demographics. So maybe you're just collecting some basic information on a different demographics form. Maybe you're collecting some baseline data, which here I have as blood work. So maybe the person comes in and you collect their demographic data, and then you take some blood sample and you send it to the laboratory. And so this instrument remains blank until you get those results back from the lab, and you can enter that data. And then you may have some surveys where you get the survey into the person's hands, into their device, either their computer. You could send that via email, or if they're in your lab or clinic, maybe you just open it for them to take on the device in your lab. Okay. And instruments can be two different things. They can be data entry forms or they can be surveys. What's the difference between these two? A data entry form is used by a study team member when logged into REDCap. So this would be me standing in front of my computer, and maybe there's a patient. In the clinic, and I'm asking them, okay, what is your age? What is your name? First name, last name, date of birth, and I'm entering that directly into my computer. That's not the participant entering here. And actually, the participant should never enter on this screen because there's a bunch of tools here, and they could actually access your other projects, and if there was PHI in there, that's a compliance issue. So data entry form is a REDCap user logged in, entering data into the form. A survey is delivered via email, public survey link, QR code. There's some other ways to do this. You can just open it up. As I mentioned, you can open it for them, and they just sit and start to work on them. But the big thing here is they don't need to be logged into REDCap to complete. So you can just give them an email invitation, or however you're delivering that survey, and they can open it and they complete it without being logged in. All right, and when you build the instruments, as I mentioned, you're building a series of data entry points, and it's mostly done with point and click functionality. So when you create fields looking like this, you basically just get a little dialog box here where you enter some basic information, and you can create fields to collect any data that you want. And when you create these fields, the required information that you need is a variable name and a field type. So you have to say if it's a text box, if it's multiple choice, a calculated field, anything like that. And you have to give it a variable name, which is its machine readable name. That means if the data connects to this variable name. That is the minimum you need when you're creating a field. You also will usually have a field label, which is considered the human readable information of the field. So if you have a question like, please rate your, or not a question, but an item on a questionnaire that says, please rate your anxiety for today, you would put that in the field label, and then maybe your variable name would be something like anxiety today. So the variable name is kind of a shortened, condensed version of what the field label, the human readable version is. And then there's some other features you can add. I've talked a little about validation, where you can make it a date, a number, other things. You can make it required. You can say it's an identifier. You can change the alignment around a little, and you can give a field note, which provides a little extra information. And just a little more about field label versus variable name. So the field label, again, if I'm entering data, I'm going to see this field label. What is the participant's age, height in centimeters, weight in kilograms, those sorts of things. But then when I export data, if I export it with the variable name or in its raw format, I'll see a lowercase shortened version where it's just age here, it's just height here, weight here. And this is what the uh, the data connects to. And so when you move to production, this is something that you cannot change. You cannot change the names of these variables once you're in production, because that could actually lead to data loss. You can change the field label because that's not what the data is connected to. That will change what the person sees here. There are some implications to that as far as your study, and if the data it still means the same thing. Like for example, if I change the age variable, the field label on age, to say what is your height, that wouldn't make very much sense with what the data was before. So you can make minor changes to, like I could change this to just say participant's age instead of what is the participant's age, and that would be not a problem. Okay, so a couple things we'll do today after we build an instrument is to test the instrument, and we'll also test it as a survey. You really want to test a lot before you move to production. So at first, a lot of times that's you sitting at a computer sending surveys to yourself, or pretending you are basically every role on your project if you're the one building your project. So you start by testing it yourself. Then ideally you move on to have study team members test, where they log in and they do some of the similar things you're doing. Maybe you send them surveys to fill out and just make sure everything works correctly, the wording's the way you want it, things like that. And if you can, and if it's appropriate, you can have non-study team members test the survey. So if you've got if you've got a colleague that works in another lab across the hall, you could send it to them and just say, hey, does this all make sense? Does this look right? And then if you do some data collection testing, I encourage you, if you're working with a statistician or a data analyst or somebody who's receiving that data to analyze it, or whatever the next step is, I encourage you to work with them too and just see if it works, the exporting works for them. And I mentioned having other users test. So the last thing I'll mention before jumping into the demos is the user rights page, and how you can add people to a project. So if you create a project, you have the ability to add other users to your project. If you did not create the project and someone adds you to their project, you may or may not be able to add users to that project. Basically, when somebody adds you to a project, they can determine what your user rights are, and they can determine whether you have the user rights privilege, which allows you to add other people to the project. They also determine if you can make changes to the project, or if you can just enter data, or what you can do. But if you create the project, you can be the one who does this. Or if somebody adds you to a project with user rights privileges, you can add users to project. But you want to think about this when you're adding users to projects. So for example, data entry people, usually don't need the highest level privileges, right? If I'm only coming in and entering data to forms, I don't need to be able to do project design or user rights. I just need to be able to access that form, enter the data, and save it. And I do encourage you to have more than one person on a project that has um, user rights privileges because people do leave studies or leave labs or leave the university. So it's just easiest to have a backup person who can add people and change user rights.